So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for making the effort to join the session today. I know you're in the middle of exams. Some of you have the exams behind you, so maybe this is an easy way to end the week. But whatever situation you are in, thank you very much for joining. So the program today is that I will introduce briefly the items that we are going to discuss. And then we are going to have a breakout session. And as in past sessions, Dr. Gao will participate in one and I will participate in the other. But each of the two classes, or breakout sessions rather, will be led by one of the students. And I see many emails about who those students should be and substitutes and so forth. So I don't know who they will be. It's a surprise for me. But I look forward to hearing the contributions from the two students. So we'll have a breakout session for about 45 minutes. There are 3 questions. So we should try and cover the themes of the 3 questions rather than every individual subpart. The subparts, in a way, are written to just stimulate thinking, but I really wanted everyone to focus on the 3 broad themes that are represented by the questions. So if you could explore those a little bit in the breakout session, and then we'll come back in plenary session, and then we will conclude. Now, one of the things that I would ask you to do, and that will be very helpful for me for the Tuesday lecture next week, because as you recall, the schedule has been revised so that next week the classes start at the same time, but the 2 lectures will be on Monday and Tuesday, and the seminar will be on Wednesday. So on the lecture on Monday, we will conclude with some of the funding aspects of IFIs, and I think we're about to launch into talking about borrowings and some other aspects of funding of IFIs. And then we will talk about the financing for development. And that will take us through to the end of Monday. So Tuesday I kept in reserve so that I can talk about particular subjects or particular issues that are of special importance to you. And maybe there are some elements of this course that are relevant for other courses that you are doing or for some research that you are doing. Or it may be that some of the things that I've talked about are just not entirely clear, either because they're complex subjects or because I could have done better in explaining them. For whatever the reasons, if you could let me know and I will address those again. So what I would ask is that each student during the course of today or tomorrow, if each student could identify an issue that they would like me to address. So just write a single sentence, and if you could send that in centrally, I think we have an email address that you could send your question in. So as you know, the course is assessed partly by participation. So I would ask that you participate in this way, and each student could send in an email. So again, the email would just be to say, could I please speak a little bit more about subject X, which is of relevance to you because of some research you're doing, or could I speak about subject Y because you didn't fully understand it from the initial session, or could I talk about subject Z, which you found particularly interesting, but could I expand on it? Something like that. So with that introduction, let me now turn to today's seminar. So we have 3 questions to be considered in the breakout session, and then we'll discuss in the plenary also. So the first set of questions really all relate to governance. So we've talked about governance quite a bit, and we've talked about it in the context of the AIIB in particular. And the question here also is focused on the AIIB. So the AIIB is a good example to consider because it is the most recent in the line of major IFIs. So there are aspects of the governance of the IFI, particularly aspects that are reflected in the charter of the institution, which represent continuity, that represent an endorsement, if you like, of established practices of other institutions which are considered as worthy of carrying over into the new institution. And we talked about some of the examples of those, but one instance would be the very classic shareholding structure and the structure of the voting. So, as with other institutions, the AIIB also has the three governance bodies: the Board of Governors, the Board of Directors, and the President. And there is, as in the other institutions, there's also voting that is based primarily on economic power. There are important exceptions. In particular, as is the case with some other institutions, there are also a number of basic shares that are distributed across all the members so that large and small economy shareholders all get the same number of those basic shares, thereby ensuring that some voice is given to those members that have less economic power than others. So these elements, along with other notions such as that of callable capital, the ability to borrow, the definition of the purpose of the institution being linked to development, these are all dimensions of IFI governance that are to be found in the charters or the practices of other international financial institutions, and which have been carried over into the charter of the AIIB, reinforced by some decisions of the AIIB, decisions of the Board of Governors and Board of Directors in particular. And then there are also aspects of governance that are found in the charter which are not found in the charters of many other institutions, or which are unique to the AIIB. So a couple of instances of governance elements that appear in few other institutions, but which have been carried over to the AIIB, include the ability of directors to split their votes to reflect the interests of members of their constituency, rather than having to vote en bloc, which is what happens at the IBRD. So this practice exists at the EBRD, for example, where shares can be split, and this is being carried over to the AIIB as well. Another example there would be, as with EFAD, at AIIB, there's also a possibility to amend the charter by having the highest governance body endorse an amendment proposal, rather than having to go back to the members and to go through the parliaments of the members and so forth. So that's another instance of a government that's been adopted also. And then there are a few instances where there are governance innovations that are unique to the AIIB. So one that we talked about was the requirement in the charter that the president be elected through an open, transparent and merit-based process. And we talked about how the Board of Governors has adopted election rules to reflect that. So there are other governance innovations unique to the institution. One would be that we also talked about is the requirement that the AIIB put in place an oversight mechanism to deal with complaints of third parties, whether in relation to misprocurement, allegations of misprocurement, or complaints by people who are affected by the projects that the AIB finances. And we saw how at AIB there is, in response to this, the board of directors has established a unit that reports to the board of directors rather than to the president, and which deals with many of those subjects along with evaluating projects of the institution. And another aspect of governance, which is also touched on in the question that we're about to discuss, relates to the issue of delegation of project approval. So we saw that at the other IFIs, the responsibility for approving projects resides with the board of directors, whereas at the AIB, that is also the case, but the charter provides for the possibility for the board of directors to delegate to the president the ability to approve projects. So that is something that the board of directors has acted upon. And so in principle, all projects will be approved progressively by the president, but this is being phased in the manner that we have discussed previously. So that's an important element of the governance of the institution. So when you discuss this first question, please draw on those and other considerations. So in the second question, we're going to look at one important aspect of internal administration. And this really goes to the heart of the independence of the institution. So the International Financial Institution is legally independent from its members. There is no liability on the part of members for actions of the international financial institutions beyond making good on their callable capital. So there is limited liability, there's independence of legal existence. And for the IFIs to operate effectively, they need to have a political independence as well from their members. So this is reflected in a number of provisions in the charters of IFIs, and we looked again at the example of the AIIB. So think in this question, when you're reflecting on this question, how, is that desirable? How practical is it? How well does it work? And here we talked, for example, about how the presidents of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the IMF, they're always American, Japanese, or European, respectively. So that's not a rule, but that's the practice. Is that a healthy thing? Is that wholly inconsistent with good governance, or is it a way of binding in the political support for the institution of the most influential members? So these are considerations for you to reflect on. And then the final question picks up on one aspect of yesterday's lecture, where we were looking at the relationship between IFIs and external actors. So we noted that in many instances, what marks the relationship is contract. So there is a contractual relationship between the international financial institution and the parties with which it is transacting corporate procurement, purchasing. We saw too that contract is what underpins the treasury activity of the institution, is what underpins the operational activity. And we spent some detail yesterday we spent some time yesterday looking in detail at some of the aspects of the contractual relationship between the IFIs and the counterparties in relation to financing agreements. And we took some time to look at the governing law and dispute resolution provisions of financing agreements. And then we touched on a little bit, and this is what I'd like to explore more today, we also touched on the relationship between the IFIs and those third-party actors with whom there is not or is unlikely to be a contractual relationship. So we noted that maybe there are instances where a contractual relationship can be implied, but in most of those instances, there will not be such a contractual relationship. And so one example was that of regulators. So we noted that, as we have in the past, that being a creature of public international law, the international financial institutions are not regulated by institutions of national law. But that does not mean that the IFIs live in complete isolation and that they're wholly disconnected from the world of the member states. So there can be this interaction, and sometimes it can be brought about as a result of engaging with members in a particular way. So if an IFI wants to raise funds to issue a bond in a member state, it will have to engage with the regulators of the regime in which the international financial institution is engaging. And there are other instances, and this goes really to the heart of the question today, where what happens at the domestic level in terms of policy output can have a bearing on the way in which the international financial institutions operate, or in the content of the policies that are adopted by the international financial institutions. So we saw the example of how the IFIs are not regulated by environmental regulators. However, if there are conventions, as there are, that deal with various aspects of, say, environmental degradation, and these are useful reference points for the institution, then they can be adopted, as indeed has been done by the AIIB in its environmental and social policies. For the staff of the international financial institution, they're international civil servants, they're independent from the member states, they owe their allegiance entirely to the institution. Their contracts of employment, as we saw, are not regulated at the national level, but they're regulated by the letter of appointment, by the internal law of the institution, and by generally accepted principles of international administrative law. But nonetheless, the content of the staff directives that apply to them, the content of the HR policies that are developed by the board of directors or by the president, they can be informed by what happens at the national level. So if the institution has to decide on what's an appropriate amount of maternity leave, an appropriate amount of paid maternity leave, unpaid maternity leave, it can do this in the abstract, or it can do this by having regard to what happens at the national level. And probably there's no consensus at the national level, but nonetheless, it can take into account what happens in, say, some representative member countries. So regulation by third parties does not have a direct bearing, it can have an indirect bearing. And of course, sanctions of states is another example, but we're not going to talk about that so much today. So that's my introduction to those three broad subjects. So please, in the breakout sessions, do reflect on the three questions. Try and look at the detail of a question of each question as prompts to stimulate thinking on the themes of what I would be most interested in hearing about in the feedback, and what I think would be most valuable for you in the discussion is in the breakout session is if you can focus on those themes of governance, the internal administration, particularly political independence, and the relationship with external actors, and in particular, how do they indirectly impact the activities and policies of the institutions. So with that, I would ask that we now go into our breakout session and we allow ourselves 45 minutes. That's more or less 15 minutes for each subject. And then we come back in 45 minutes. And if you, Lauren, or one of your colleagues could bring us back after 45 minutes, that would be great. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the conversation. Okay, I think we're all back together in the full session. So good to see everybody. People in my breakout session are very shy because now they've all reverted to mute function. Yes, so they've stopped the video. But no need, they were very active during the discussion. So let's now address each of these questions. We had the benefit of Professor Sato in our group, but he wanted to talk about something that meant that we paid a disproportionate amount of time to some questions and could have done with another half an hour to discuss the last question. There we go. So let's hear back from the two breakout groups. So who was in the section that you were in, Xuan, who was leading that breakout group?
It was co-led by...
Okay, right. So do the want to begin talking about the first question, the one about governance?
I'll start off, and then we did a similar pattern as before. We tended to spend quite a long time on the first question and then ran out of time and then tried to rush through the end. But anyway, we'll do our best to summarize what we discussed. So regarding governance, we said that it's not favorable to have such an election process that is not merit-based, transparent, and open, although that has been the norm in groups, IFIs such as the World Bank in the past, and it remains so in others. But it's not good to be seen to be awarding leadership through a closed process of favoritism to simply some historical standard or perhaps some kind of large shareholder situation. It should be open and transparent, and it should be merit-based. But we did struggle on the question of what defines merit, how to decide if you're going to have a merit-based election process, who gets to determine such a thing. And we discussed that while it's of benefit to have certain guidelines, they shouldn't be too specific because that could rule out some potentially quite beneficial characteristics or qualifications, but that at least some guidelines should be somehow given by the institution to guide the process. We also talked about the fact that the governance as a principle should focus on the collective good, not only the good of the largest shareholder or some kind of historical precedent. And so that principle of fairness needed to be underlying as well. And finally, I would say we discussed about the resident versus non-resident board and the positive and negatives on that, which is for the resident board, they're quite well paid, which means that perhaps you can attract people of good quality for a good quality work. However, the bad point is that perhaps even very well qualified people may not want to relocate away from family or away from their hometown. A non-resident board is not as well compensated as a resident board. And as well, they're not really expected to be full-time devoted to their duties. So that could mean that perhaps they're less focused or don't perform quite as well. Although I would say we can't say that as a blanket statement. So that was our answer primarily for the first question.
did you want to spread the answer over the co-leaders, or you were dividing the work?
We divided it by question. So if we have a chance to summarize question 3, then I will hand it over.
Very good. Okay, so did you want to share your thoughts for our group?
Sure. So I think for the first question, our group really emphasized the importance of international financial institutions being beholden to some kind of international law in order to regulate their operational policies, their governance internally and externally. And we didn't think that it was a good idea for them to not have a very, to not have a very comprehensive charter. And the charter should be very detailed and should not necessarily, very verbose, but just very detailed and specific about, certain allocations of responsibilities and how to appoint board directors and so forth, so that it's easy to be able to kind of relate it back to some kind of international law. And that's what we thought would be, kind of a hallmark of good governance. And regarding the non-resident and resident issue, we also found that, where the AIIB might be very modern in its thinking in terms of, preferring to have a non-resident board of directors, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most, that it's like the correct or, the most, I guess, the most effective way to have a board. There are still drawbacks that I think Lauren's group also mentioned. But we also did say that for the second sub-theme, the first sub-theme of that first question, which is about a departure from the IFI norm, we do applaud the fact that the AIIB kind of moves away from like the traditional idea of certain countries taking the lead in the board of directors. For example, the ADB usually has a Japanese national as the president or populating the board of directors. So that's what we thought about the first question. And if anyone else from my group wants to add something, you can.
So I think that means that other people in our group feel that you adequately covered the issues there, so nothing to add. But maybe I can ask Dr. Gao if there's any comment you would like to make on the governance question before we move to the next question. Do you have anything you would like to share on this?
Thank you, Gerard. I think our student leaders did a wonderful job summarizing the discussions that covered, I think, all the key points. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Yes, so on this, I think it's a very big subject. I'm pleased we had an opportunity to discuss this in the seminar now, and we've discussed this quite a bit in the lectures. Not only when we address governance specifically, but when we address other aspects of international financial institutions, because so much comes back to governance in the end. So even on the other questions that we discussed about the political independence of the institution and of the staff, which is the next question, that's connected with governance. And the last question, about not operating as an island, the need for IFIs to be aware of and be responsive to the external world is important. And this also has a bearing on governance, particularly when you start looking at issues of diversity, as we talked about. So governance is so important. What I would say to all the students is just to be aware that this is a hot topic. It's been a hot topic in I would say, in organizations generally for quite a long time. And you can see how there isn't sort of one model that has been promoted that ought to be universally adopted, either at the corporate level or at the international level. But there is a consensus, I think, that certain things are desirable and certain trends ought to be supported. And even though there may not be one blueprint for governance of IFIs, I think some things work very well and some things I think are a bit anachronistic. And I think one thing that is a bit anachronistic is having the presidents of the institutions selected on the basis of some not very transparent process. So who knows how merit-based it is, but if it's not transparent, you'll never know. So I do think that if institutions can move away to something more merit-based and open and transparent, then that's a good thing. And I do think that this is one of the ways in which the AIIB's formal rules are very good. So it has a charter obligation to achieve this outcome, and there are now rules for the election of the president, which have been adopted by the governors. So that's all very good in terms of outcome. So let's move on to question 2. So will you be taking that forward?
We actually didn't discuss question 2. We sort of spent most 90% of the time on question 1 and then rushed through question 3. Would anyone in our group like to extemporaneously speak to question 2?
Yeah, our group basically have very limited time in discussing the question 2. So, in the discussion, we basically combine the second part, like the residency, the problem of residency. Combine this question with the second question. So this part of discussion is quite like the point is not a lot, but we mentioned about the fairness of having the directors elegance to both the organization and the members of the represent. If they only represent for their for the organization, they probably could ensure the fairness better, I think. And another point is that to the second question, what role, if any, should considerations other than merit play in the collection of the director and the president and appointment of vice president and stuff? I think other than those merit that we mentioned before, also members probably should abstain from actively participating in political campaign, and as they should show the professional loyalty owing toward the organization, because it's just too hard to limit the influence that the membership or the nationality that could influence the policy making in the process. And another point maybe should be considered is that I think that president also should show the same, they have the same value with the institution. Like if the IFIs dedicated to the principle of more freer international exchange or international financial markets, I think it is also important for the vice president also advocate the same value with the institution. So I think so that's probably the main point that we mentioned in the discussion. If there are any other member would like to add some points in my group, please add any comment if you like.
Thank you very much. Would you like to speak on behalf of the second group, please?
Yes, sure. Okay, so for the second question, we kind of thought about it as how businesses structure their appointment policies and how they appoint, for example, their own boards of directors. Because the hot topic right now in businesses is about diversity. And we're not just talking about like racial diversity or gender diversity, but it also includes maybe a diversity of occupational experience. And all these factors in consideration could benefit an international financial institution, especially if there are projects that are to be undertaken in probably, let's say, countries with a history of conflict and where maybe some members of the board of directors who may have some kind of experience implementing projects in such an environment would benefit the efficiency, maximizing the efficiency of the IFI in that region or that country. And, we also thought that perhaps the diversity of an IFI can in the future be used as a benchmark of perhaps how they can respond to risks, or maybe how they are able to represent their members' interests more fully and more deeply. But we also thought that, there are still some arguments, a lot of arguments about implementing diversity in these institutions if they want to maximize efficiency or maybe even profit, because diversity may be seen as kind of slowing down making effective decisions. Because if there are, let's say, if there is too much diversity, they might say that the members might argue with each other too much, and that could stall decisions from taking place. But overall, our group is very much for diversifying a board of directors, because there needs to be a more effective way, an efficient way of dealing with projects in maybe regions that the current members of an institution are not used to, and diversifying the board of directors would be beneficial overall to such projects.
Maybe if I can just add a comment to that. I think that having a diverse workforce and having diverse governance bodies, it must be a good thing in terms of generating many perspectives that can then better inform decision making. I don't know if it's always good in terms of achieving efficient processes. Probably having a very if everybody thinks the same way and has the same view and has the same cultural attributes and so forth, probably it's quite easy to reach decisions more quickly. But are they better decisions? In international financial institutions, like international organizations generally, the institutions may not have that much influence over the diversity of the governance bodies. So in IFIs, the directors are elected by the governors. And the governors are appointed by the members. So the institution itself won't have any say in who the directors are, which in fact is an important aspect of governance. You can't just have those who are overseeing your performance, people who you yourself have appointed or approved of. So it's important in terms of the accountability of the institution to have that distance, but it does mean that the institution is unable to achieve diversity at the level of the board. So it's quite funny, actually. In the three institutions that I've worked out, it's quite often been the case that someone at the board will lambast the management for not having sufficient diversity in its ranks, but the staff will be vastly more diverse than the board of directors from which that individual is drawn. And if you look around the boardroom, they will all be people who are not very representative of societies at large. But that does happen, and I don't know how it's solved, but it's hard for the international organization itself to solve the problem. And then the other thing I would say about diversity is that when people talk about diversity in international financial institutions, they probably talk about nationality diversity as much as they do about gender diversity. So I think in a corporate environment or domestic environment such as a national government, then diversity is probably about gender, sexual preference, whether people are disabled in any way, things like that, or ethnicity. So all of those things are important as well in international financial institutions. I've not done a study of all the codes of conduct, but I believe that the modern codes of conduct of the international financial institutions would identify as misconduct, discriminating against any staff based on any of those criteria that I listed, and that's certainly the case at the AIIB. But nationality diversity is important, and I think one of the reasons it's important is that it's always critical for the effectiveness of an institution to ensure that its members are fully behind it. And so you can't have too great a disconnect between the membership of the institution. If the institution, which is there for the benefit of the members, is to be effective. And one way of achieving that level of support is if members can see that some of their own nationals are working for the institution, and especially if those nationals are working at senior levels. So that's very important for the members. Now, the formal rule is that technical competence should always trump other considerations when hiring staff. In some institutions, that extends also to the vice presidents. And as I said, at the AIB, you have a rule saying the president should be elected on a merit-based process. But I believe that the reason that there's always an American in charge of the World Bank and always a Japanese in charge of the Asian Development Bank and so forth is that this is one way in which the institution can ensure the continued engagement of that member, particularly for times that may turn out to be quite tough, where, for example, there's a need to turn to the principal shareholder or to a particularly influential shareholder to take a lead in supporting some initiative of the institution to get it through a difficult stage. For example, if there's a need for a capital increase. So if you are in the case of the IBRD or the case of the ADB, if there's a need for a capital increase, it won't go anywhere unless there is support from the US and Japan, respectively. So having an American or a Japanese national as the president is one way of ensuring that, say in the United States, the Congress would be broadly supportive of the work of the World Bank. And of course, Congress can be very critical sometimes, but it would be much more critical if the US did not have the presidency. But does it go too far? That's the question for us to consider. Shall we move to the third and final question? Who's handling that at your end?
Well, I'll do the first bit if my wonderful teammate who did question 2 would again handle the last part of the question. So this is addressing the question of should IFIs strive to have consistent administrative and operational policies with other IFIs? So I said, yes, this matters quite a bit, especially in 2 regards. Number 1, just like in the private sector, IFIs have to contend for the best talent. So they should be watching other IFIs in terms of how they offer any benefit, any salary, what kind of people they're looking at, and they should be mindful of the fact that any potential staff would also be watching these types of criteria, and they might choose to work for a different IFI based on what's on offer, so to speak, based on salary. At the end of the day, they're still employees and they still have such considerations. So this kind of regulation and consistency matters. Sorry about my dog making a sound. Sorry about that. And then in the second regard, it matters because IFIs sometimes have to cooperate and collaborate with one another on different initiatives. And Professor Gao's words were where they need to sometimes co-finance something. So they're much more likely to be able to do that efficiently and also trust one another if they can have a understanding that there's some consistency in the practices that they share, and the types of administrative instruments that exist will help to facilitate any such cooperation. So that's all I wanted to say about that. And sorry, I'll pass it over to my teammate.
Oh, thank you. I have already mentioned 2 very big point that we discussed in our group, and I will just add some other points that yes, admittedly, they are keeping the consistency of different IFIs is very important, as just mentioned. But also, one point that I should mention that since IFIs are focusing on very different regions, and the local situation is quite different from the region to region, and especially when it comes to financial, economic policies to make. So and there's another point that maybe having a original and more suitable not just financial policy, but also in the administrative and operational policies will suit better for the local situation. And yeah, add to the second regard that mentioned before about the cooperation. Yes, it's quite important, and also if there's something like global financial issues happened, having a standard administrative or operational policies will also help in the cooperation with IFI. So in that set of point, having the consistency of administrative and operational policies would be beneficial. So this is for the first part, and for the second part, we actually run out of time, so we didn't discuss a lot. But for the third part, what role should the domestic law on employment condition influence on the content of IFI's human resource policies? First, as a general consideration, that generally speaking, in the field of public international law, domestic law always just be considered as a general fact, not just a fact, but they do not possess any legal effect. So from that perspective, maybe the domestic law also should play a limited role in the field of international financial institution. And another point that the Professor Gao mentioned that since domestic law is quite different on the human rights resource policies, like another group member that mentioned that, for example, China allows for very severe human resource policies, like inside of some of industry, they allow for 996, which means you have to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and 6 days a week. But also there are situations like 009. So in that circumstance, following the domestic law, it's like it's just every country will have very different domestic law on the human resource policy. So in that situation, we think that we should apply the international law, and which is also better for the management of human resources, and also it also consistent with the international public principle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, would you like to share views from the other breakout session team?
Yes, sure. So for the third question, we thought that this is a very complicated issue about to what extent they should take reference from other IFIs, and which IFIs, and which kind of rules, regulations, policies they should kind of emulate from these other IFIs, and the other one is whether they should adhere to domestic law. So I'll kind of cover the first one first. We kind of thought that IFIs across different regions and across different, I guess, different interests and different, like, they might be different, they might be interested in different policies from one IFI to another and different types of projects. So we thought that it's kind of impossible to implement, all of the different administrative policies and all the different rules within each domestic situation into one IFI. So we thought that, but that doesn't mean that we thought that that doesn't mean that an IFI shouldn't take points from these other IFIs, because they will have some kind of useful points of reference that another IFI can look at. So for example, the AAIB can look at the policies that the ADB kind of implements, because it would also be, because their kind of goals would be sort of similar, it would also be beneficial for them to adhere to similar laws that would, or policies that, for example, might prevent them from doing business with like a fraudulent organization or a fraudulent individual. But that being said, we did highlight that IFIs shouldn't be, like a certain IFI shouldn't be hindered by what another IFI does, and it should have its own independence to, in order to kind of choose which policies are most beneficial for their organization and for the kind of projects that they're interested in. And yeah, the rules can't really be applied uniformly to one IFI or all of the IFIs. And regarding the domestic law issue, so we brought up the fact that certain countries might have a lower minimum wage than what an IFI would provide for their staff, or different labor laws, different job security laws that are applied to that IFI versus that country, and we thought that it would be it would hinder the employment rights of these the staff in the institutions if they were to fully adhere to some countries' domestic laws regarding labor laws. Like, I think Professor Sanders mentioned the issue of the ADB in Manila, which often conflicts with, like, the domestic laws in the Philippines often conflict with the domestic laws that an IFI might want to adhere to. But at the same time, we also recognize that sometimes an IFI might have, let's say, a less progressive law or a less progressive policy than a domestic law might have. So like maternal leave in one country, let's say a European country, might be longer than what the IFI could provide for, or that European country might allow for smoking indoors, but the IFI kind of is like, okay, should we follow other countries' policies regarding health and safety? So there's always a conflict between the extent, like the progressiveness of a domestic law versus an IFI, and the IFI isn't necessarily more progressive than the domestic law. Does anyone else in my group want to add to that?
I have nothing to add, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that. So Dr. Gao, any final thoughts on this particular point or anything that we've discussed in the seminar today?
Thank you, Gerard, and thank you, the coordinators. Maybe just one point which I may clarify. That is, the selection of the executive head of an international organization, including IFIs, like the election of the president of the World Bank, is pretty different from selection or recruitment of other international civil servants. So the first selection is rather political, like all elections. In a national context, elections are always political, even if in some organizations you have standing rules to govern the process, to govern the selection, and in other organizations you do not really have any standing rules. But the election, just by nature, is rather political. But the recruitment of international civil servants is much more properly regulated by many policies, many regulations, many rules in different organizations. Yeah, just one point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important point. With that, let me thank everyone for participating in today's seminar. Very interesting. I think we could continue having this conversation for several more hours. A lot of questions, a lot of interesting topics to cover. Really appreciate the effort that people have made today. Thank you very much.